And we are back. We're going to talk about some wrestling lesson, and I want to talk about the Gold Dust Trio. It's obviously a group that comes up quite a bit when we're talking about pioneer-era professional wrestling here in America. And I said I wanted to do a part that was one of the first structured promotions. And I'm sorry, the Gold Dust Trio, that was the first technical professional wrestling American promotion. The first professional wrestling promotion ever. No other evidence of this other than Carney Circuit Wrestling. That was the only other time when that happened. Now they contributed to several fundamental changes in the business model of the professional wrestling industry, and ultimately changed the direction of the sport towards more of a pseudo-competitive exhibition rather than a shoot fight. Right. The three of the Goldust Trio, obviously, are Ed Strangler Lewis, who was the dominant world heavyweight champion, the shoot fighter, his manager, Billy Sandow, the meticulous showman, actually he came from the carnivals as a freak show showman, and that's why he was signed with wrestling backgrounds. Because Billy Sandow, kind of going offshoot, because really a lot of people saying, why is Billy Sandow in this? He wasn't really much of a wrestler. He actually was the person to promote wrestling in the freak show with Ringling Brothers at the time. And then obviously the creative visionary of Toots Mondt. This is way before McMahon, by the way, too. This is early 1920s. So Sandow was looking for a sparring partner for Lewis, because this is how this started. Right. And fill an opponent. And Farmer Burns, who was Toots Mondt recommendation or trainer, wanted Gotch. So Frank Gotch became involved within this sport, and they actually had this. Toots Mondt comes in watching this, and he discovered a solution where people were not interested in the catch-as-catch-can wrestling at this point, because they associated that part of wrestling with carnies, with freaks. And the decline of the freak show at this time was very prevalent, because the freak show was up and down, up and down, up and down. So Monts discovered a solution to this, and he convinced Ed Lewis and Billy Sandow to implement a new form of professional wrestling, which combines features of boxing, Greco-Roman, freestyle, lumber camp fighting, and feeder into what he deemed slam-bang Western-style wrestling. This new style of action, which include radical moves, and I'm not kidding you, these were radical moves at this time. Body slams, suplexes, arm drags, and fisticuffs, combined with traditional mat grappling to create what has essentially become the modern form of professional wrestling. This is where it started, right here. This was nowhere else in the world at this time other than Toots Mondt. That's how groundbreaking this was, and this was in the 1920s. Okay. Slam Bang Wrestling was an instant success with fans because it became more fluid. There was a lot more hard-hitting action. Mm-hmm. And this is when a fix came into play, because Ed Lewis was too good to lose this title. So Mondt went up to them again and said, hey, when we need to start building new stars, because obviously Ed Lewis cannot wrestle forever, we have to fix, or it was fix, but now at this point it was called finishes or pre-scripted conclusions to matches. Ed Lewis did not like it at first. Not because he didn't want to lose, because he thought that the fans were going to instantly know that this was going to happen. This is how confident Toots Mondt was. He personally invested 90% of the finishes into finishing holds and put in actually the majority of his savings into the next event that they were going to promote with this new revolutionary now idea. And obviously, it was an enormous success. I think they sold out multiple times in multiple places, and everywhere from Cleveland, Ohio, to New York City. Almost the same amount of crowds. People would travel from Montana, from Washington, and everywhere else around, and to go to these events because it was so popular within newspapers, and it was really, really popular with construction workers. And factory guys, because they also did not have the exorbitant prices than boxing did even at that time, where boxing was selling for $15, which was a crazy amount of money back then for a one-day show. Pro wrestling was doing it for $2.
Right.
So a much more affordable thing, and it was still very much they still bet on it despite it being fixed. And all of that, we'll get into that later. So they were not even called the Goldust Trio until a book called The Fall Guys in 1937 came out and deemed them the Goldust Trio because they were making so much money, and it seemed like any decision that they made was nothing but gold. Right. So that's why they were called this. Now, this is to promote the new style to a greater scale with books as well. So Tutamont, Sandow, and Lewis did put a big investment within the book, and they actually sold these books at events as well, which is actually one of the first things of wrestling merchandise at that time. And they also had wrestling cards too. Now the cards moved from old burlesque theaters to major sports venues. Once again, a big time difference because it used to be in theaters. But now, since they wanted to really go big time, they actually scaled to sports venues. They had stables as well, tag teams, and that was something never even seen at this time. This all happened within the scale of the Goldust Trio and that promotion. And the promotion was called Goldust Trio. And they did primarily wrestle out of New York because they had Madison Square Garden all the time because Mont had the connections already by promoting boxing. So within the year of 1937-1938, the Goldust Trio took control of the professional wrestling industry, and then they started bringing in big box office numbers or big box office draws like Zbyszko, and then with some of the other people like John Pesker and all of these people, and then they separated out. And we talked about that. We talked about that in the previous one. They recognized, the trio recognized that that people were getting tired of Lewis continuing with the belt. So he, at a certain point in time, he would voluntarily take the title away from him. Right. And that generated new interest because, oh my God, somebody beat Lewis. And that was actually a thing. It was almost a predestined hashtag because the papers would always put in blank beat Lewis. And everybody knew what that was in New York, especially. And people were always waiting until who beat Lewis. Right. So really it was a hashtag, and papers fluctuated based on who beat Lewis. Right. And it was essentially the same thing like with your Muhammad Ali's and stuff like that too.
Right.
So this was working the match, and then they started to sell rivalries and feuds because, and it generally focused around Lewis at the time because he was the main draw. So they worked programs around this with like the Young Stars or the false finishes and stuff like that. It was very rudimentary stuff. Like this was not anything there. The trio were the first ones to establish a hierarchy with their talents. Okay. And only legitimate grapplers were even considered to be the champion because Ed Lewis did not want to lose to anybody else but legitimate athletes because he wanted to make sure that his name was still very prevalent. Right. Very much the same way with like a bratty Shawn Michaels or something like that. Oh, I don't want to lose a Bret Hart because blank and blank and blank.
Right.
just really try to keep that up. And obviously that went on until Ed Strangler Lewis and Billy Sandow left.
Right.
And Toots Mondt, trying to figure out what to do later, came into contact with Jess McMahon, who was doing boxing. He went to boxing. They translated into wrestling with this knowledge, and the rest is history.
Right.
So when I bring up, the reason why I bring up the Goldust Trio so much is because that is how unbelievably groundbreaking they are. And when we're learning about wrestling, when we're learning about the Graps, we need to understand the pioneer fundamentals,
right,
because it's something that we really take for granted.
Right.
And I think bringing this into the spotlight is one of the best things ever.
Right.
So that's kind of our wrestling lesson with the Goldust Trio. When we come back, we're going to be talking about professional wrestlers and social media.
Yes.